and welcome to Rethinking Education, the video series where I talk to some of the most interesting voices in education and explore their ideas on teaching and learning. I'm Dominic Traynor, I'm a teacher and one of Adobe's education evangelists, and in this video I'll be talking to Oliver Caviglioli, former special school head teacher, education visualizer and author of Dual Coding with Teachers. We'll be deep diving into dual coding theory, as well as why and how we should apply it to our teaching practice. Let's see what Oliver's got to say for himself.
Hi Oliver, well it's nice to meet you. We had some technical issues there, but we managed to get through it. God, that was a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah, I'm glad you were both here to help me out.
Well, likewise. Yeah, and you as well. Just for our audience here, I think it would be really good if you could give them just a really brief intro into, yourself, your background, the kind of work that you're doing at the moment. To certainly mention the books that you're working on as well.
Sure. I spent most of my life in special schools, and the last decade of which I was a head teacher. And then I left and became a trainer and an author. And now I call myself, and it sounds a bit preposterous, an information designer. Because that's what I do. I'm committed to visualizing and clarifying educational ideas and processes.
Nice.
And I've written some books which I may talk about later.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Can I ask you what your first book was? So you said you were a head teacher for 10 years. What was your first book when you kind of left?
The first book was 20 years ago, called Mapwise.
Right. And what was that around?
It's around mind mapping and how to use it in the classroom.
Oh, right. Okay. So this is...
But it's 20 years old. I'm embarrassed by much of it.
Hey, no.
It's kind of, yeah.
I know what you're saying, but yeah, I mean, everybody, it's a journey, isn't it? It's a journey that it started there and that is where you are now. So, I just think it's really interesting to think about how people transition from, say like a head teacher, for example, and going into, the kind of field that you're in now and how that evolved. So, could you tell us, obviously the chat today that we're having is very much focused on dual coding. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you kind of, how you see it and how you came across it, and just give us a little bit of a story about Oliver and dual coding.
First of all, it's not new. So it's a theory devised by Allan Paivio in 1971. And it essentially means using visual strategies. So they've been around forever. So nothing new. So you could have kind of a view, it's just a bit of rebranding. So over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, education's focused on cognitive science. And so within cognitive science was this technique that everyone thought was new called dual coding. So all of a sudden, where people might have poo-pooed the idea of using visuals, being less academic, less cognitive, within the branding of cognitive science and dual coding, all of a sudden, hey, let's look at this wonderful technique. So it's been given a rebirth because of its name. Right.
And did you see that actually in your own experience that, people did kind of poo-poo that visual side of learning and saw it as kind of less almost academic? Did you see that as a head teacher?
Yeah, I did, because the visual strategies were adopted by, this isn't a legitimate divide, but there's a traditionalists who hooked onto cognitive science, and there were progressives. Mm-hmm. Life's not like that, but let's characterize them as that. Yeah. So in the progressive wing, they hooked onto visuals, one, because they had a misguided notion of learning styles, and we'll hit that myth later. Mm-hmm. Also, it was a romantic notion that just by drawing and doing wild connections, there'd be this marvelous learning going on. But it was undisciplined, it was pretty much ignorant of the facts. So it kind of deserved to die and be reborn in a far more rigorous fashion, which is what's happened.
Okay, and you talk about that sort of that sort of traditionalist and progressive, the sort of two halves, and I take your point. You're absolutely right. Life's not like that, but you've kind of managed to marry those two things up quite well. As in, you do a lot of stuff. I've seen you on Research Ed, for example. I've seen Chartered College of Teaching course that you've done as well. I mean, how do those how have you kind of brought those two worlds together, or has that been done for you? How has that worked?
Well, I'm going to answer it kind of elliptically. Last year, John Sweller, Mr. Cognitive Load,
Mm-hmm.
and Dylan Williams says it's the single most important theory to learn.
Right.
He wrote a paper last year in which he updated cognitive load theory, and in there he included something called embodied cognition, which is the act of making gestures and moving as seen as being aiding our small working memory.
Mm-hmm.
And so the traditionalists have had to really wake up and take into account their God has now legitimized something which they used to put in the progressives camp, that mindless activity and movement,
Right.
which most of it is. But when gesture is linked to hard thinking, then it helps embed it in your mind, and it helps support the limited constraints of working memory. So I think dual coding's been part of that.
Right.
I just talk straight about what the research says, and what people who've used it, like the graphics world, have known about dual coding theory decades before education did. So we're really catching up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think even the Egyptians were quite into the dual coding, weren't they, through hieroglyphics?
Sure. But I'm talking about the graphics world knew about Allan Paivio. They knew about dual coding theory. So because of our ideological abhorrence of the other side.
And when you say the other side, what do you actually mean?
Well, the traditionalists and the progressives.
Yeah.
So the progressives characterize traditionalists as being heartless machine makers
in their ivory towers.
And the traditionalists view progressives as being soppy hippies.
Yeah, complete nutcases.
Yeah.
And you're a bit of a mix of both.
Well, that's called being human, isn't it? Because we have both sides.
Yeah, well, exactly that. And one of the things that I put in the notes here was that, sort of relating to this is, are we just, and obviously these things are designed to be slightly provocative, but, are we just talking about, let's help out some visual learners here?
Okay, so the learning styles is just nonsense.
Yeah, well, of course.
But it's really plausible. So if you don't look at the evidence and you just look at the argument, we're all different. Would you, if you take them through a Platonic argument, would you agree that we're not identical? Yes. Would you agree, therefore, that we're different? Yes. Would you agree that, therefore, we're different in all sorts of ways, one of which is learning? Yes. You take them along the argument and you'd be convinced, I must, therefore, teach according to the different ways that my learners learn.
Yeah.
Really plausible. And it seemed like an ethical decision to do so. But then when you hear the research, actually, it's just not true.
Yeah, it's a complete blend, isn't it? All over the place.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I was quite interested in, because I know a lot. I've done a lot of work in sort of reading around things like this, because I used to specialize a lot in languages, and Memrise is I don't know whether you've heard of this company that use kind of this style of sort of dual coding in order to aid things like language learning. They do other things as well, but they are very heavily going down like photos and videos, that kind of route, and matching those to words and audio and things like that. But you concentrate on the kind of the more of the graphics and the icon side. Is there a reason for that, or is it just a sort of simplicity play? How does that work?
Well, let's go back to one of the original questions. What is dual coding? So I think there are two stories. The first story is the one that's known by everybody, and it's a story that Allan Paivio researched for 4 decades. And it's a very simple story. It is that when we have an auditory and a visual channel. So when you have a word and you have an image, and they have some kind of relevance and link, so those two separate things become one unit. Then in terms of learning process, which is, psychologists called learning encoding, dual coding is double encoding. So you have the word side of the meaning and the image side of the meaning. You double the strength of learning it. You double the encoding. Professor Paul Kirschner calls it double-barreled learning. And so in in the other side of the cycle, when you're reviewing or rather retrieving it, you double the chance of remembering it.
Exactly, yeah.
But what people don't realize is that Paivio was working with really simple content, cognitively unchallenging stuff. So when you're learning just vocabulary, you know, I want to learn the Japanese word for house, Japanese word for toilet, then dual coding is really useful. But of course, education and teachers are far more involved in cognitively challenging material. And that's where we have story number 2. Now, Paivio didn't research this, but he did talk about it. He said that the structure of words and the structure of images are different. So words are obviously linear, like one thing after the other.
Yeah.
Images come all together. And so it's processed differently. And other psychologists did some research on that. They called it the visual argument. They give one group of people a piece of text about something, and the other half, they gave them a really formed diagram. And they were asked questions, comprehension questions, and later on retrieval questions. And the one with the diagram fared better significantly. And he put that down to, and here's a bit of jargon for you, the computational efficiency of diagrams.
Right.
What that means is you can find things easier, you can recognize things easier, you can see their links explicitly, and you can make inferences immediately without any seeming cognitive effort. It's just obvious to you. Whereas in text, it's kind of, you have to go back and forth. The connections are abstract, they're not visual, they're not concrete. And so it's a lot more intellectual work. And so inferences really stump a lot of students, a lot of pupils.
Right. Okay. I mean, it's interesting, this, isn't it? Because you think so we're kind of thinking. I guess there's almost a sliding, there's a spectrum, like with everything, like you're saying, you know, in life, and sort of at one end you might have, you know, the most basic of diagrams, and at the other end might be a whole I suppose. What's the other end of that spectrum? Is it kind of like, is it almost like a film or something like that, where you've got, you know, moving image and audio and, you know, maybe text on screen or whatever, you know, that sort of audio visual play. And at the other end of it is the very basic nuts and bolts of, you know, simple icons, simple graphics.
Kind of, though, you introduced something else, which we'll talk about later on. The trouble with video, it's transient. Similarly with teacher speak, the information's transient, it disappears. So that's a really useful distinction to consider. But here, that experiment, which was duplicated or replicated many times, had a similar level of complexity. So on my course, I show teachers a piece of text that's really short. It's about a project in a school. Who's in charge, which faculty and department are in charge of which part of the project. And I give them 3 simple questions and they're stumped. There's rarely one person can answer one of the questions. Yet the grammar's easy, the words are really familiar, but they've had to make too many inferences. And then I show them a diagram, a really simple tree diagram. Like there's the history department, there's the geography department, and between them, I make a board of the people who are in this common project. So immediately they're able to know which department has more people in the project, what the people in the project names are called, and who's not in the project. It's so explicit.
Right. Okay. And
Yeah.
so yeah, definitely.
So that's story number 2.
Yeah.
Conveying complex content through diagrammatic form. So it's not just one word, one image, or one icon to learn a simple word, in, out.
Right.
That's really useful. But schools are far more than just learning lists.
Of course.
It's really, you want to call story number 1 is about learning lists.
Okay.
Learning lists. So if it's only that, we could stop now because I've got nothing more to say. Find a word, find an image, practice it, go.
Right. But obviously that is still an example of dual coding.
That's dual coding. The story number 2, whether we call it dual coding or not, or whether we call it multimedia learning, as Richard Mayer calls it, or which I think is confusing because people think about
Of course.
computer screens or anything else.
Yeah.
I've continued calling it dual coding. No, it's not exactly accurate.
Right, so it might be sort of like diagrammatic kind of
it's useful. And Paivio did talk about it
right
at length about the structural difference.
Right. Okay, that is interesting. So in terms of what, I mean, because you talked about that list learning, and I was thinking, is there standard common practice in schools already where dual coding is being used? Because the easy one that springs to mind is obviously every phonics class in a primary school are using flashcards or probably something around that. So are there sort of standard things that we can sort of put teachers on now to think about? Yeah, I'm already using that, and now I need to develop my practice. Where's it being used already?
I think it's being used alongside knowledge organisers, which are just a collection of lists in secondary schools and primaries too. And my guess is that language teachers have always used it to learn vocabulary.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because there are many subjects that you could get to at different levels, but it's really hard to get involved in a language unless you know some words off by heart.
Of course.
So you just need to learn a lot of vocabulary, and so dual coding's used for that. That's in the story number one.
Of course.
List learning.
Yeah.
List learning.
Yeah. And so
it's been used. Go ahead.
Go on. No, go on. Carry on.
So story number two, diagrammatic form, is fallen in and out of fashion. And it's only since dual coding, as I've promoted really, has been around, that has had a tremendous influence. So in terms of current practice, previously in my most enthusiastic moments, I never imagined the frequency and quality of graphic output that teachers now create. In my wildest moments, just didn't think it was possible. Didn't think they were interested. I didn't think they were bothered to learn the graphic rules. I didn't think simple enough technology was available. I didn't think they would see the results. But I was being completely proved wrong.
Wow.
Just tremendous, unbelievable. If you follow me on Twitter and you see the knowledge organisers and charts and timelines and all sorts of graphic organisers, you'll be spellbound. I'd be proud of many of them. Unbelievable quality.
And I guess a lot of teachers will be thinking about displays and things like that. What's because I know that this like you talked about traditionals and progressives, there's also teachers who love displays and teachers who absolutely hate them because they kind of question the value of them, I guess. And I would imagine that you might agree with half of that, but also say that we're probably missing an opportunity to actually use them in a more effective way.
Sometimes I look at the research in schools for children with autism with completely blank walls. And with my architect father's aesthetic minimalist point of view, I'd almost favour it. So all the attention's on the teacher and whatever display they've got. So you know that from an evolutionary point of view, what human beings notice is rapid change. Because that's what ensured our safety and our survival. So when things are there a long time, and it doesn't have to be long to be a long time, like a day, then we no longer notice it. So pretty much most of the displays in schools, I don't think are noticed. I think they're a waste of time.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember that from when I first started teaching myself, and I would see the amount of work that would go into displays and think, actually, and also, all sorts of things strung up in the classroom and all sorts of things on the walls, and think, actually, is that effective? Because also a lot of, I'd imagine, also in that story one, dual coding story one, for example, is that actually having it in your face all the time is completely opposite to spaced repetition, for example.
Well, when it's on there, why learn it off by heart? So it kind of makes people lazy.
Right. Yeah. No, I get
Makes
that.
people lazy.
Yeah, yeah,
The other thing is that, I mean, since I first started teaching, there were these, when you start teaching, you come into a culture and it's very hard to start questioning, but there was a culture around displays. So I'm talking with the 70s. So head teachers, local authority advisors, all had this uniform view. So in my era, displays had to have drapes, drapes, drapes. Things need to be triple mounted.
yeah.
So there are whole sets of rules.
This debate continues to rage on, I think, from the
Yeah.
70s.
And from an early on, I became very unpopular. I used to ask people, inspectors, why should we listen to you? In what way are you qualified? What do you know? Have you worked in the graphics industry? Do you know how magazines are built? You know, tell me what your architectural sensibility is. Do you know anything?
I bet that
And
went
they
down
knew
like a lead
nothing.
balloon.
They knew nothing. It's just that's how we do it here.
Well, it is.
And so-
I mean, that's a whole another conversation, isn't it? Around
Culture.
Yeah.
So we got rid of the drapes, and instead we've got this curvy, crinkly, corrugated cardboard.
Yeah. Oh,
Board
God.
and why?
Because
Why?
obviously it improves learning.
It's just a nonsense. It's if you want to see, they live in this bubble. Nowhere else outside does it work. So I sometimes joke on my course. I say that, you know, I've saved up and I bought my wife this really great painting. It's really big painting, £500. And she's an infant teacher. She was an infant teacher. When I gave it to her, she wouldn't accept it. It wasn't right. And of course, the audience go, why? It says, because you wouldn't be satisfied if it was hung up in our walls until it had that curvy corrugated cardboard around it.
And it was triple
And
mounted.
in that instant, you realise that what happens in schools is an absolute nonsense. It has nothing to do, it's totally unrelated to anything that we've learned to discover and practice in the outside world.
Well, I mean, that leads us really nicely on to the next question, actually. So, you know, how would you like to see dual coding being used? You know, in an ideal situation, in your ideal school where you could have your say 100%, how do you want to see your dual coding used by teachers and by students?
What I'd like to see is that in this current focus on the curriculum, we get past the idea that we drip feed information to students, we do activities, and at the end of which they develop this schema, this integrated, coherent, knitted, multidimensional connection of facts and knowledge and ideas. My view is they should start with that on a simplified version. So at the beginning of a topic or a lesson, the teacher would show them a diagram, preferably built up bit by bit, explaining how everything's connected and how we're going to investigate each of these separate parts in more detail later on. So it's just like if I were your guide and we were going to a new town, we were saying Belgium, and I'm going to show you Brussels. Mm-hmm. What I wouldn't do is just walk you around blind in Brussels. Here's a road, here's a road, here's a road, here's a road, hoping that bit by bit you join all these roads up, and in your mind you'd get this map, and at one point you'd get this insight. I've got Brussels. I understand Brussels. So what I would do, I would show you a roadmap, but it wouldn't be the full roadmap because that would blow you away. I would give you a model. So a model is a simplified version. It's deliberately simplified based on the explainer, the teacher's knowledge of the background and prior knowledge of the audience, the students. Mm-hmm. So as you know, the secret in teaching is you give them what they know and a little bit more. Mm-hmm. You kind of a bit of stretch and you judge that. So I would give you a map of Belgium, of Brussels, which would have the Atomium, the Heysel Stadium, a few other bits, no more than 4, and the main roads.
Yeah.
The station. You go, right, I've got it. And then now we're going to explore the Atomium. It's this bit here. And then gradually we'd explore it, and I show you a map with a bit more detail. Mm-hmm. So the cartographic metaphor or parallel is really useful. It's obvious in the real world what I do. But all of a sudden we lose that common sense idea when we're dealing with abstract knowledge. We give it a bit, rather than to have what is called by David Ausubel in the 1960s an advanced organizer. An advanced organizer, other people have termed it, it's like having a hat rack. So when you go into someone's hall, if you have a hat rack, you have somewhere and something upon which you can place the hats and scarves and coats and brollies. If you didn't have that, it would just be a pile on the floor.
Yeah.
And no one can find anything. So if you don't give students a hat rack, metaphorically speaking, a grid, a metaphor, a cupboard with shelves and trays, a mechanism which is meaningful, that absorbs and collects in a meaningful way the information, then you're just going to overwhelm them.
So this is really interesting in terms of the curriculum, because I can see what you're saying. You know, when you sort of get a student in, you know, at the start of term, for example, you would present them with a kind of dual-coded, you know, overview of where they're going to go, say from, you know, September to half term or whatever. You know, maybe you want to break it down. Is this kind of thing? Do you see it as possible in the current system? And, you know, the amount of content, the amount of curriculum, and the way subjects are siloed, is that an easy thing to do?
Well, I've had some really remarkable stories coming from schools who have reproduced a strategy that I use in my course. So I'll go through the strategy because teachers could do it themselves. So in my course, I teach the teachers. I said, you're going to be a novice because my guess is you're not going to know a lot about this topic. And I'm going to be a self-styled expert because I know a bit about it. So my name's Caviglioli, which is a Corsican name, not Italian. It's Corsican. And so I teach them about Corsica. Not everything, you know. So I've got a map with 4 main branches. So here's what we do. I say, here's the main center of the map. It's the Corsican flag. And I explain it. Right, copy it in your sheet of paper. So they copy it. So going back to that thing with embodied cognition, gestures, drawing and tracing are really significant supports for memory. So then the first branch comes out and we talk about the geography of Corsica. And they have a very simplified map, and then we go through the percentage of the island which is covered in mountains or forestry and number of beaches. So we go through all that. They copy it all down, and then I stop, because otherwise any more will be overwhelming. And then in pairs, so if you and I were a pair, your job then would be use the index finger of the hand that you write with and make direct physical contact, and you trace the line under the word that you're elaborating. And for some classes, you may say, here's a rule. Every single keyword, I want at least 2 sentences from that. So you don't just read the keywords. You have to elaborate, make it into sentences or phrases. And you go through and you tell me a story. Now, to make sure that I'm not just a passive listener, I will listen to what you're saying, and I will trace my own map in liaison with, coordinating at the same time as you progress through your branch. And I may even silently in my head just say the key word while I look at it, trace it, and hear you.
Giving it in
and then
context.
And then I introduce the second branch, and we both trace it, and then we may swap roles. So we do that for all 4 branches. And if you've got the time at the end, you would then trace and tell me a story about the whole map to me. And then, so you would do the branches you've done initially, and then you do the branches that I had explained to you. And I would do similarly. And then you take the maps away from the screen and in front of them, and then they draw it from memory, totally by memory.
Right.
And I ask them to start like this. Look at the blank sheet of paper, and inside your head, I'd like you to replay the tape you've got of your explanation. At the same time, put your finger on the piece of paper and get your arm and your finger to, because it does remember what the shape of the branches are. Then you pick up the pen. So they remember what it heard like, what your narrative was like. They remember what it felt like. They remember what it looked like. They put it all together and they redraw the map. Incredibly. And they could redraw it again an hour later. But what they would need to do, because David Dido's great distinction between performance and learning, that was kind of performance because it's still quite close.
Yeah, so you've got that sort of element of regency, for example.
Yeah, so space practice, they would redraw it next day and then perhaps next week.
A week later, yeah.
Yeah. So in a school that builds in revision is an admission that they don't know how to design instruction. Because if you did this at the start of every topic, the students start with the schema. So they have a hat rack upon which the detail. So later on, when we're talking about the French Constitution and Pascal Pauli, we say, do you remember we looked at French invasion and their occupancy of Corsica? Well, here is, right, so it fits in. So in fact, at any time, I could start speaking about a new topic and I'd stop. Where does that belong?
Right, belongs on this branch.
So I'd say, Dom, tell me where it belongs and tell me why you think it belongs there. Oliver, where do you think it belongs? You think it belongs somewhere else. Explain to David why you think it belongs there. And David, you listen to his explanation and tell me, has it changed your point of view?
Yeah. Okay.
So,
and there's a couple of things from that. Is the strength in dual coding that it is generated by the user or by the learner? Is that because there are two different ways of doing it, isn't it? There's sort of teacher down, I've created this sort of dual coded information for you, or there's, auto generated by the student. What is the most powerful there?
That's a really great question because it brings up something that I think has had insufficient attention drawn to, is that while we're evidence informed, what really becomes interesting, initially it's problematic, then you can think, well, actually it's interesting. You get two bits of evidence and they kind of contradict each other or they play against each other. So let me tell you two here. It's true that student-generated anything, but so in this case, student-generated diagrams are more meaningful and therefore more memorable than somebody else's, the teachers. So that's one. So if you only knew that, you go, great. So let's get students to draw maps of Corsica.
Yeah.
And etc. or Brussels, etc. And that's really what happened in the phase when visual strategies were adopted particularly in primary and progressives. So I've been to primary schools where the kids were mind mapping and the content of their maps and their categorization was incorrect.
Right.
And so they were learning something incorrect. And if there's one golden rule in education, is don't let students learn something wrong. Never let that happen.
Because the time it takes to unpick that is just...
it's just so wasted. If eventually you can. There's lots of research in scientific misconceptions that actually we never really get rid of our misconceptions because it seems so intuitive to us. And so the other bit of research is that novices, and it's not a derogatory term, a novice is someone who is unfamiliar with new information. An expert is someone who's familiar with it. So when you're teaching something new, and that's what teachers do most of the time, students really are novices and they cannot categorize, order in a meaningful and accurate way that which they don't know. It's like so obvious.
Yeah.
How can you do you know anything about European phenomenological philosophers? For example.
Haven't looked at it for a while.
So organize it. Why would we ask someone to do that? So that's when, and giving the Corsica example, you know nothing about Corsica. So I didn't tell the teachers, go on the website, on your phone and just find out what you can and cobble something together. So I gave them the bare bones of what it was.
So I suppose
Now,
there's two
these-
things there. The things that,
but I just want
go
to
on.
finish off.
Yeah,
These
yeah.
two are opposites. But then we also have this thing called scaffolding.
Mm-hmm.
So novices don't always stay total novices. They may not become, you may not ever become a real expert in Corsica, but some way along the line, after me having gone through my map of Corsica, you'll know a lot more. Then when I teach you some more, and when you go and discover some more, you know where that information will live.
Right.
So on a bigger picture, you've got a scaffold. Then in more detail, you can work out how to organize that finer detail as you move from novice to expert.
Right. Okay. So there's
Scaffolding's the answer.
Yeah. So there's a kind of a balance between the two. Then, so you've got
Yeah.
So just to see if I've sort of interpreted this correctly, they need the help, or we all need the help of an expert in order to organize the knowledge that we want to gain and retain. But actually, if we can get the help of the expert in order to organize that knowledge, actually producing the kind of almost like the kind of images or icons or artwork or whatever we're doing in order to achieve the sort of dual coding aspect of it, if that's user generated but helped to place in the right place by the expert, that's the kind of the sort of golden triangle or something.
Yeah. I mean, another aspect as well, in that Corsica thing, we redrew the map. I mean, there's other ways you could do it. So I could show them a map with, say, half a dozen words missing on the branch, and they know where they're missing. And below the map or the diagram, I've got perhaps 10 words. And as you know, with multiple choice questions, each of which should be a plausible answer.
Right.
You then ask them to find the words that fit the gaps. So it's the same as multiple choice, but instead of being given a list, the structure of which and the interrelationship of the content has no meaning. With a map, the physical placement, the arrangement, when words are close, they have more meaning together than when they're apart. That's, by the way, a Gestalt principle, that proximity equals similarity.
Okay.
So when you do multiple choice question with a map and they're working it out, every time they're looking and moving and placing, you're reinforcing the meaning, which is made explicit through the physical arrangement.
Right. Okay. So there's almost like the physical kind of location of each one helps to embed that on an even deeper level. Are we getting into triple coding now?
Well, this is the really interesting point. I'm kind of obsessed by this point. So you need to tell me if I get too complicated. But it's a very simple point. It is that when we're toddlers, we learn some things about the world. So let me just give you one example. We have a container, we have a jug, or rather we have a cup and we have a jug of water. And a toddler will learn to fill a cup up with a jug of water. Now, as I say this, it's going to sound so obvious, but as the water fills up, rather, as the cup fills up with water, as you have more liquid, so the level rises. Yeah?
Okay.
And so we learn a concept, a foundational concept, which we use thereafter in abstract notions, which is more is up.
Okay.
So let me give you just a few examples. If I tell you that George, and I'm going to show you horizontally, George is depressed and George is happy. If I want to put one above the other on a vertical axis, which goes higher, happy or depressed?
Right. Okay. So happy would go up.
Who taught you that? Who taught you that?
Are you feeling down? I guess.
Yeah. Who taught you that?
God knows. Maybe
So
God.
we have these totally entrenched concepts we learned when we were youngsters. So morality is up, low morals. All Dow Jones is up. Have you know Dow Jones?
Yeah.
No, there's in all sorts of aspects. So, and that goes alongside proximity is similarity. So this Christmas, my grandson came over from Singapore pre the virus, and and he was involved with two fundamental activities. He had a container, and he kept putting objects in and out of containers. That's all he did.
Right.
How many containers could he put it in? Then he'd have blue objects in this container. Sometimes he even put a container within another container. You know that? You put a cup within a cup within a cup, which is the very basis of Aristotle's categorization theory. Super and subordinate categorization comes from the stuff you learn as a toddler. And when he wasn't doing that, he was on a path. He noticed that nothing happens in life unless you apply force, and then you get to a goal. So you have where I am as a path towards my goal, and I have to exert effort to get from here to there. So we have Gantt charts, flow charts, algorithms. We wouldn't have any student assessment. We wouldn't have any management appraisal if we didn't have a path. So a container and a path pretty much covers most of our abstract thinking. And as an English guy, you may need to be interested to know in 1980, a linguist and a philosopher wrote a book called Metaphors We Live By. Mm-hmm. And they analysed the driest academic papers and saw they were riddled with metaphors. But not metaphors as you talk about them in your English lessons, but sort of rhetorical flourishes. When I say that the Dow Jones is down, it's a metaphor. When I say I'm in a bad mood, there is no in. There really is no in.
Yeah.
Every preposition is a metaphor. And so if you take them out, the vast majority of your abstract concepts completely crumble. There's nothing, you have no mechanism with which to construct or communicate ideas. And so what graphic organizers are in this story number 2 of dual coding is simply a visual and physical representation of what comes out of teachers' mouths. So let me give you an English example. And I normally do this on my course. It sounds a bit strange here. I put a posh voice on. So I say something like, and I ask them, could the children who I used to teach in my special school understand this? So I say, children, I'd like you to consider the proposition that Shakespeare is central in the canon of English literature, whereas that 60s irascible playwright Joe Orton is somewhat of a marginal figure on the very perimeters, if not the outskirts, an outlier.
You've lost me. You've lost me. Totally lost me.
So listen, tell you what I've done. I've got a circle as a container. That's the canon of English literature. So Voltaire is a great writer, but he's not English, so he can't go in. My brother's an English person, but he's not a great writer, so he can't go in. So you need English, great writer. So you go into this container called the canon of English literature. It's just a circle.
Yeah.
And we know we tend to have, we call someone a central figure, don't we?
Right.
We know centre is more important than peripheral. So Shakespeare goes in the middle. S in the middle, and a circle right on the edge. O for Joe Orton's on the edge. And that is all I've said. And my challenge to teachers is, if they look how complicated they think the concepts are they're teaching, if they listen to their words, the metaphors which are inevitably dominating the structure of how they explain, you can make those into a simple diagram. So in amongst the other things that I do, I design and I illustrate books for really brilliant educational authors. And some people say to me, Oliver, you've got a real skill of being able to create a diagram of what they say. Until recently, I haven't told them my secret, because I haven't really realized until after this study of investigating what I've just been talking to you about. All I do is I listen to their words. So if you are an English expert and you told me that Shakespeare is central in English canon, etc., I go canon. So that's a container. It's either a container or a path. You can slice through everything. It's either a container or a path. I'm going container, and you'll be saying central. Central is easy. Central is in the middle, man.
Yeah.
Peripheral. Well, that's like on the edge, man, isn't it?
Yeah.
So simple.
So
Most concepts are so simple.
yeah, I mean that brings up a sort of interesting idea, a sort of interesting thought that maybe we can use to kind of wrap this kind of thing up, really, because I think that explanation that you kind of ended with there, and
By the way, ended.
Right.
That's a path metaphor.
Yeah. Oh God, I'm gonna.
Right now, say it without
now.
saying a path metaphor. See, you stumble every time you try and speak with that metaphor. You stumble.
So,
which of course is another metaphor.
Of course. God blimey, I don't know what we're going to say here. I think we'll have to move on to sign language. But one of the things that I think here is that perhaps teachers are quite wedded. I'm thinking about what the language I'm using now, but they're quite wedded.
Don't worry, let's go back to naturally.
Yeah. How they're wedded to their subjects, and how they explain, because it puts them in that position as the expert. And it kind of gives them that level of I was going to say authority, which I don't really want to make
wisdom.
Wisdom. There you go. That's that sort of position where they're kind of like, well, this is part of my identity and who I am. I know these things and I help my students to understand those things. But perhaps there's a sense in saying that actually this could be way more popular with students than it would teachers, because it kind of levels that playing field in a way that students kind of really need, and teachers might find quite difficult to kind of bring themselves to that level. Does that make sense?
The people who are wedded to being academic storytellers, weaving fabulous tales of concepts, might find that there's no need for their magic anymore. But I don't think it's that frightening. What it means is once you have the basis of knowledge, this framework is made obvious, then you use that as a platform for ever more elaborate, subtle and sophisticated concepts. So it's inclusive. So everyone in the class gets it. So like this strategy with the course map you use with any topic, I know everyone in the class gets it and will get it for the rest of the topic, and will enlarge and enrich their understanding. They start with a schema, with a schematic framework. They don't hope they'll get it at the end. But as they enlarge it, then...
And they add in the detail.
Those can add more detail, more connections across topics within the subject.
So it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because it's kind of... I suppose one of the things that you're doing with this is actually changing the way that almost teachers see themselves. Would that be fair to say?
I'm not sure whether this... Yes. I just want to go back a little bit about... I want to argue a question that you haven't answered at all, which is we're dumbing down. I think representing abstract concepts in this way not only includes everyone, but it seduces them, it fools them into engaging directly with the intellectual life,
with a sort of a level of understanding which they might have felt was a really large gap. It sort of brings like that gap slightly closer.
Those students with fancy language or with posh haircuts or posh clothes, you actually deal in the raw with an intellectual idea, and you can manipulate it. And we talk about grasping and manipulating ideas, which are the words we use when toddlers grasp and manipulate objects in containers. So perhaps to finish off this part, I'll quote Barbara Tversky, who's over 4 decades researching psychology and visuals, a world-renowned psychologist. She's summed up this whole area by saying, and here's a quote directly from her, "The mind regards ideas as objects, and we manipulate and coordinate and group, organize and arrange the objects abstractly with words as a parallel to what we did with children with objects. And what visuals do is they show what a teacher's words are aiming to do and achieve the same results more democratically because everyone's involved visually. And it's an introduction, an invitation to the intellectual life for everybody.
I think that's an absolutely perfect point to end on. When you were saying that, I was thinking very visually actually, about how that kind of made sense in my own mind, and it actually brought me to thinking about a lot of classrooms that I've either created myself or been actually seen myself, or actually and we were talking about your father having this architectural background, this minimalist background, that actually a lot of classrooms are probably quite chaotic for children as learners.
You bet.
Yeah.
You bet.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, Oliver, it was an absolute pleasure. That went in ways and twists and turns that I never thought we'd never end up at. So thank you very much. I think that's testament to you in how you actually put across your ideas. So thank you.
With no visuals, of course.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
But thank you.
So
very
I want
much.
to leave you with an invitation before you go. Notice that teachers speak diagrams. These visual metaphors you use all the time. In essence, it's as if you're describing a diagram. Why not just show the diagram as well?
That would sound. That makes a lot of sense.
Great. Thank you very much. That's a great conversation.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed that chat with Oliver. Please do follow the links to the CPD tasks, which you can do on your own at home or as part of a staff meeting. And finally, have a look at the Adobe edX tutorial where I show you and your students how to create your own dual-coded images to improve knowledge retention. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.